Welcome back to the ITSS Verona Members Series. In this episode, we're speaking to Maria C. Werlau. Maria is the co-founder and executive director of the Free Society Project, known as Cuba Archive, a nonprofit think tank dedicated to defending human rights through research and scholarship. She is author of numerous publications, including the book Cuba's Intervention in Venezuela, a strategic occupation with global implications. Maria holds a bachelor's degree in foreign service from Georgetown University and a master's degree in international relations from the University of Chile. Thanks for joining us, Maria.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So, diving into our questions, earlier this month, U.S. forces captured Venezuelan President Nicholas Maduro. During the operation, there was reported to be a heavy Cuban intelligence presence at Maduro's compound in Caracas. Could you explain the historical involvement of Cuban intelligence in the Venezuelan security apparatus?
In a nutshell, my book the book was published in 2019. I have since followed up with other sources. It has 800 sources. So it was a big investigation. It's not an essay. It describes very specifically how the Cuban regime penetrated and essentially occupied asymmetrically the Venezuelan state, colonized it, captured it, intervened. It depends on the language you want to use. As I did more and more research for the book, I changed the subject because it was impressive. The puzzle that I was put together, how it penetrated all aspects of Venezuelan society, its institutions, its security, its defense. So this information is not new. There's plenty of evidence from defectors of the regime, very high-ranking defectors in different areas, specifically in regards to security. The security detail surrounding Maduro was essentially Cuban. Cuba oversold its capabilities to the Venezuelan dictator. But the fact is that they have been doing that for years, and Cuba has been getting paid in oil and in other in contracts and in other ways at very high levels. At a time, it was up to 10 billion when Chavez was alive, and Venezuela was getting much more money for their oil products. So this is not new. It was just that the mask is off. And, it was evident they couldn't hide it because the Cuban regime, as the Venezuelan regime, have repeatedly denied that they are present in the defense and security organs of the Venezuelan state. And they have insisted that they have only been sending doctors to Venezuelan communities. Well, that's clearly not the case now, evidently.
Thanks for that background. So given the ease at which the US forces carried out their raid, there has been some speculation that the Cuban forces protecting Maduro underestimated the threat against him. Have you seen evidence of this, or do you see another explanation as more likely?
Well, the evidence is there for anybody to see. I mean, clearly the Cubans had no capacity to protect Maduro against the resolve and technology and power of US forces. What has happened is that there's been little resolve by successive US administrations to address the Venezuelan problem, which is a security threat at many levels aside from the drug trafficking. And this has been said by analysts for many years. The Cuban regime has been intent on spreading its brand across the hemisphere since Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, and they have done that through successive subversions, armed interventions. That was before with the Soviet Union money and support, and in the last 30 years with Venezuelan oil and other powers since it captured Venezuela. So what happened is, I think that the Cuban regime, up to a point, suffers what I would call an institutionalized Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger is used to explain an individual's inability to understand their own lack of capacities or an overestimation of capacities. And I think that's what happened with Cuba. Cuba has been very successful gaining disproportionate influence overseas, internationally, and gaining support, the fact that it's a totalitarian dictatorship because it has a very sophisticated and well-resourced intelligence, propaganda, and diplomatic apparatus. For that, they have had many international successes, but only in the sense when they have not been confronted with real resolve to say stop. And that's what happened here. So I think Cuba oversold its capacities to the Venezuelan regime, specifically Maduro, but it's understandable given that Maduro has been a man of Cuba since he was very young. He was trained in Cuba in an ideological political school when he was a young labor member, not really a leader, maybe a small leader in the Caracas bus network. And he was probably an agent of Cuba, a man of Cuba since he was very young. So for that relationship comes back from decades. And there's been a sort of agreement between the two regimes of structural dependence. Venezuela provides Cuba funds to continue to run barely its economy now, which has totally failed. It's a parasite state since the 60s. And Cuba has provided sort of defense, strategic planning, intelligence. It appears now that that has been oversold to the Venezuelans.
Thanks, Maria, for bringing all those linkages together. Now that Delcy Rodriguez has taken power as the next president of Venezuela, do you foresee the collaboration between Cuban intelligence and the Venezuelan state continuing? Or do you think that there might be a likely change in the situation?
I think there's already a likely change. I think it's clear that this is for real. Delcy Rodriguez, the de facto president or the chosen one to do this transition, has rhetorically stated that Venezuela has the right to its relations with whoever it wants, including Russia, Iran, and Cuba. But it's not what Delcy says what's important, it's what Delcy does. And Delcy has clearly been surrendering or abiding by the United States guidelines and how this transition is going to go at a very quick pace. So I think the Cubans, on the one hand, will be scrambling to continue having an influence, to avoiding the US sort of occupation or administration of the transition. But I think the Cuban regime is very weak and is going to have to face reality. So whatever they're plotting, that will continue. That's the way Cuba has operated historically since Fidel Castro came to power. But I think this is pretty much the end because, the Venezuelan connection was very important to keep the Cuban economy going. That has diminished over time, but was key, and it's still a critical element. And now with this sort of defeat of the Cuban force in Venezuela so quickly and so ably by the United States, Cuba clearly has no means of defense against, the military might and the resolve of the United States.
Thank you, Maria. So expanding on that, US President Donald Trump has effectively cut off Cuba's access to Venezuelan oil stores. Do you believe that this move will significantly impact the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela, or is it too soon to say at this stage?
Oh, the oil is the easy part. Clearly that's happening. I don't see any possibility for that to be maintained. The critical element here now is Mexico. And the Mexican government is led by Claudia Sheinbaum, the leader of a party, Morena, that is a very close ally of Cuba. They're part of the what you call the Sao Paulo Forum network of countries that have adopted the 21st century socialism model, which is to achieve power through elections, even if they're stolen, but through elections, and to dismantle democracies from within, taking over their institutions. And that's what is happening in Mexico. And, the Mexican government last year became the first importer. The oil from Mexico, oil and gasoline imported by Cuba, is a first and outdid the Venezuelan volumes last year. And then Mexico has been selling Cuba medicines, vaccines, has a very large medical brigade. And in Cuba has a very large medical brigade in Mexico, which is around 3,100. And this week was being increased by more medical technicians, nurses, and doctors. And then the doctors and the brigade that is being evacuated from Venezuela by Cuba will probably end up in Mexico because that regime or that government is intent on aiding its ally. I don't know how they're going to pull it off. And that certainly, in my view, would just provide oxygen to a terminal patient because the Cuban economy is really destroyed. And all they can do is keep the regime in power because the Cuban regime does have control of the security and repressive apparatus. That does work in Cuba. How long can they keep it going with more diminished oil sources and less support? That's questionable. I don't think it's going to be they're not going to make it probably till the end of the year. So the oil is decisive, but it's the combination of factors that will spell, in my opinion, the demise of the Cuban regime. However, we're just guessing. I predict that might happen or it's likely to happen, but things can go wrong. The Venezuelan transition could go wrong. There could be chaos. There could be other actors that step in, like Russia and China, which I don't, at this point, estimate that will happen because Russia is busy with the Ukraine war. The Chinese are more transactional. Cuba, they know that they can't maintain Cuba. Cuba does have a value strategically and geopolitically for those two actors, but I don't see them coming to the rescue. Iran has very deep problems, as you know. So those are the partners. Belarus, which is another partner, doesn't have the means to really step in. So I think the oil is key, but it's more than oil. And, for certain, the oil is not going to be flowing from Venezuela to Cuba.
Thank you so much for those insights, Maria.
Cuba's longstanding sort of commitment to take over the Latin America and the Caribbean, and the fact that this occupation of the Venezuelan state has been the best example, but is not the only one, because that was already the case to a degree in Peru under the Velasco Alvarado military dictatorship. It was certainly during the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. It was the case at the end of the Panamanian dictatorship under first Torrijos, but then certainly Noriega, which led to a U.S. invasion, by the way. We had during the Allende regime in Chile. So there's been examples, not to the point that Venezuela was taken over by Cuba or occupied asymmetrically or whatever, but certainly there's that example. And then, of course, the subversive and armed interventions by guerrillas that started in 1959, that was a pattern until the end of the Soviet Union. And then Cuba, Fidel Castro designed this new Foro de Sao Paulo model and 21st century socialism, which was able to advance a lot with the money from Venezuela and now is weakened, but is certainly has been very effective. And still there are leaders of the major countries in Latin America, like Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, that are participants in that scheme. So it's been pretty successful in a way, which maybe led to the idea that they could protect Maduro against a U.S. action. I think nobody could have predicted the U.S. military operation to be the success that it was in removing Maduro. I mean, obviously everybody was reading the tea leaves. The forces were there outside, the military buildup. I was expecting, targeted bombings and sort of, but I never thought, I didn't expect something like this to be so well planned, so successful, so devastating to the Venezuelan regime. Because short of an invasion, and that's certainly not what happened, how do you control that country? We just took Maduro out, let's say, but you didn't stage an invasion and an occupation to take over the defense, the security, the ministries, the administration of the state. So the way that it's being done is quite devastating for a country like Cuba, certainly for the Venezuelan regime, and successful for the United States and the protection of security and democracy in the hemisphere.
I have just one last small quick question. Where do you think this leaves Cuba, and where do you think Cuba, what's on the horizon for Cuba, given the loss of Venezuela?
As I said before, I think for the horizon of Cuba, it's the end of the regime as it exists, because economically, they can't keep the lights on, literally. The blackouts in Cuba are lasting 16 hours. People have no water for days. I mean, that's just basic. There's hunger, there's lack of food. The infrastructure is devastated. Agricultural production, industrial production, tourism, everything. I mean, there's no basic medicine in the hospitals. It's a major economic, systemic crisis, emanating from the fact that this model of socialist central planning has turned Cuba into a parasitic state since the 60s very quickly. Because Cuba was, if you look at UN statistics, one of the best economies in the region. And in terms of socioeconomic indicators, I mean, that's there. That's not challenged. That, forget the propaganda, look at the data. So that model has produced misery, but has been supported externally, first by the Soviet Union in great amounts, and then by Venezuela. And now Cuba receives donations even from small island countries in the Caribbean. I mean, from the whole world, and sadly without conditions, that have not pressed Cuba into doing structural reforms and protecting human rights. So I think it's the end of the rope, because to bring that economy to a stable point is nearly impossible without a major assistance by multilateral agencies and, the big countries in the world. And who's going to do that? So their allies, as I mentioned before, I don't think are going to step in. They can't save it, because it would take probably trillions of dollars to reconstruct Cuba and billions to, keep it going minimally. It could be that the regime manages to get by, and you have, a sort of prolonged Haiti-like situation in Cuba, a progressive decline, and that could happen to a point. At that point, the ruling elite, which lives because they have imposed state-controlled capitalism in the economy, and they live very well, they eat very well, they have billions of dollars in safe havens, and Switzerland and other places. They have assets abroad. They could decide, okay, it's time to leave and just take a plane. That's a small part of the elite. Or they might just say they're going to resist. Right now, they're saying we're going to resist. They're giving the, housewives rifles to defend the country, which is ridiculous, but they keep people occupied like that. That cannot resist a occupation. And most of the Cuban population, if you go on social media, is asking for the Americans to come and invade the country and save them. I think that is true. I don't think the United States is going to do that, obviously, but how do you keep that going? I can't fathom how that's going to happen. And especially now that they've lost their main ally in Venezuela. So my prediction is things are going to get worse before they get better. And that's very sad because I know a lot of people in Cuba. I mean, I'm in constant touch with what's going on. I'm reading about it. It's tragic what people are going through, but the regime is intent on staying in control. Now, can they keep it? Because to keep the repressive apparatus going, you need to have some funds, and they have less and less funds. So, you have that. And then to keep, for example, military intelligence working, because that's what keeps the armed forces without conspiracies and coups against the regime. Can they keep that going for how long? I can't answer that, but it looks to me that it's getting very difficult, and that probably the regime will end in some fashion in the next few months.
Thank you.
My pleasure.